In the winter of 1924, on a wind-scraped hillside above the little harbour town of Avalon, a man knelt in a shallow trench and lifted a human skull out of the dirt. He turned it over in his hands. He had done this hundreds of times before, and he thought he knew every kind of bone this island could give up. But this one was wrong. The jaw was too heavy, the brow ridge was too thick, and when he laid the long arm and leg bones out beside his own body to measure them against himself, the numbers he scratched into his notebook that afternoon would go on to haunt American archaeology for the next 100 years. The man's name was Ralph Glidden. The island was Santa Catalina, 22 miles off the coast of Los Angeles, and the thing he claimed to have pulled out of that burial ground was not supposed to exist. Over the next several years, Glidden would tell newspapers from Los Angeles to Boston that he had uncovered the bones of a lost race, not the ancestors of the people everyone assumed had lived here, something older. I have to pause here for a second, because what I just described, that is one case from a much larger pattern. There are 35 documented cases in a document I put together. Different cities, different decades, different types of evidence. Every single one follows the same sequence: discovered, documented, acquired, disappeared. I could not fit all of it into a video. It's in the pinned comment below. Find it before we continue. Something taller. He spoke of skeletons that stretched 7 feet, 8 feet, even 9 feet from skull to heel. He spoke of fair hair and light skin. He spoke of a civilization that had vanished so completely that history had simply closed the book and written a different story over the top of it. And then, almost as quickly as the story rose, it was buried again. The funding vanished. The institutions went quiet. The bones were scattered, sold, boxed up, and forgotten. And the official record settled back into place as if none of it had ever happened. So the question that hangs over this island is not really about giants at all. The question is this: when a discovery threatens the story we have all agreed to tell about the past, who decides whether that discovery survives? And what happens to the evidence when the answer is no? To understand what Ralph Glidden found, you first have to understand the island itself, and the people the official history says were always here. Long before it was called Catalina, before the tourist boats and the casino ballroom and the glass-bottom cruises, this island was called Pimu. The people who lived here were the Tongva, a maritime society who crossed the open channel in sewn plank canoes, traded shell bead money up and down the coast, and quarried a soft blue-grey soapstone that was prized for hundreds of miles inland. They were not primitive. They ran an economy. Their bead currency moved through a network that stretched deep into the mainland interior, and the bowls and pipes they carved from island stone turn up in sites far from the sea. And that economy is worth sitting with, because it is the part of this story that everyone rushes past on the way to the giants, and it is the part that actually matters. The soapstone of this island was a strategic resource. It could be carved into cooking vessels that would not crack over a fire at a time when almost nothing else could, and that made it valuable across an enormous stretch of coast and desert. The people here quarried it, worked it, and moved it outward through a trade system that functioned, in every meaningful sense, like a market. Shell beads were the currency, craftsmen were specialists, wealth accumulated, and it was buried with the dead. Which means the graves of this island were never just graves. They were the ledgers of a working economy, written in bone and bead and stone. Anyone who opened them was not simply disturbing the dead. He was cracking open the account books of a civilization. That is the story the museums tell, and by every honest measure it is true. The Tongva were here, they were sophisticated, and the graves that cover this island are their graves, their ancestors, their dead. But here is where the ground gets unstable, because in the early 20th century a handful of men decided those graves were a resource to be mined, and one of them decided the bones inside them were telling a story that nobody in charge wanted told. Ralph Glidden arrived on Catalina as a boy in 1896, when his family moved out to the island. He was not a scientist. He worked as a carpenter. He had, by most accounts, no formal training of any kind, and there is real doubt about whether he ever even finished high school, but he had a hunger and he had a talent for two things. The first was digging. The second, which would matter far more, was telling a story that people wanted to pay to hear. Sometime around 1919 he began opening graves in earnest, and he was astonishingly, relentlessly productive. Before he was done, Glidden would claim to have excavated more than 800 burial sites from over 100 separate locations scattered across the island. Thousands of artifacts, by his own count, close to 4,000 human skeletons. It was, without exaggeration, one of the largest private collections of human remains ever assembled by a single man in North America. And for a while, the establishment did not look away. It leaned in. His work caught the attention of one of the wealthiest and most powerful collectors in the country, George Gustav Heye, the founder of the Museum of the American Indian in New York. Heye's foundation began funding Glidden's excavations. Almost overnight, a carpenter from a resort island was dining with an oil and banking fortune, digging with institutional money behind him, sending crates of bones and artifacts east to one of the great collections of the age. Think about what that means for a moment. This was not a lone crank working in the dark. For several years, Ralph Glidden was doing exactly what the institutions wanted done, funded by exactly the kind of money that decides which discoveries become history and which ones disappear. He was inside the tent, and you have to understand what the tent was in those years to feel how strange his story is. The early 20th century was the great age of the collectors. Enormous private fortunes, built on oil and railroads and banking, were pouring money into a race to fill the new museums of the eastern cities. Native remains and native artifacts were not treated as the heritage of living people. They were treated as inventory. There was a market, with prices, with dealers, with competition between wealthy men to own the largest and rarest holdings. A single spectacular find could make a career or fill a wing. Glidden understood this market perfectly. He sold and traded the remains he pulled from the island to museums and to private collectors, moving human beings as commodities across the country. He was not an outsider to the system of buying and selling the past. He was one of its most productive suppliers. That is what makes the moment the money left him so worth examining. The system did not reject him because he was a grave robber. Grave robbing was the business. The system rejected him for something else. And then, in April of 1924, the money stopped. The Heye Foundation informed Glidden that their research into the Channel Islands was, in their words, finished. The funding was cut entirely. Officially, the reason was simple. The institution had what it wanted, the project had run its course, and it was time to move on. But 1924 is also the exact moment the story changes. Because it is right here, cut loose from the institution that had backed him, that Glidden began to talk about giants. Now, the skeptics have an easy explanation for that timing, and we should put it on the table honestly, because it might be the whole answer. Glidden had lost his paycheck. He needed money. And a museum full of ordinary bones does not sell tickets. A museum full of a lost race of blonde giants does. So the story writes itself. A desperate man invents a spectacle to keep the lights on. That is the official verdict. Hold on to it. But also hold on to the other question, the one the official verdict never quite answers. Why did the institution walk away at the precise moment the bones started getting strange? Because that same year, in 1924, Glidden opened his own museum in Avalon. He called it the Catalina Museum of the Island Indians. And what he built inside it was one of the most disturbing spectacles in the history of American showmanship. The centerpiece was a great circular display. At its heart sat a large soapstone burial urn. Radiating outward from that urn, arranged like the spokes of a wheel, were the skeletons of 64 children, their skulls turned inward toward the center. And around and beneath this arrangement, Glidden mounted the bones of the adults he had pulled from the island's graves. The walls were hung with skulls. Femurs and shell beads were worked into decorative patterns. He wired the dead into furniture and frames and let the paying public walk through the middle of it. It was ghoulish. There is no softer word for it. These were not props. These were real human beings, the ancestors of a living people, torn out of consecrated ground and rebuilt into a roadside attraction to sell tickets to tourists, stepping off the steamer from the mainland. And Glidden gave them a story to go with the horror. He no longer called himself a carpenter. He called himself Professor Glidden. In some accounts he called himself a doctor. He hired a publicist, a former Los Angeles newspaper woman named Alma Overholt, and together they fed the press a steady diet of wonders. The Boston Globe would go on to call him the famous archaeologist Ralph Glidden. The transformation was complete. The high school dropout with a shovel was now, in print, a man of science. And this is a detail the revisionists love, and honestly they have a point about it. Watch how easily an expert was manufactured. There was no committee, no credential, no peer review. There was a shovel, a fortune, a publicist, and a newspaper appetite for wonders. A man went from carpenter to famous archaeologist in a handful of years purely because the money and the press decided he should be one. If authority in this field could be conjured that quickly for the man selling giants, then ask yourself how much of the authority on the other side, the authority that later dismantled him, was built on anything more solid. The revisionist is not asking you to trust Glidden. He is asking you to notice that trust in this whole arena was always a thing that got assigned by powerful people, and just as easily taken back. And the science he was selling was this: a lost race, light-skinned, fair-haired, blue-eyed, intelligent, enormous. A people who, he claimed, had lived on this island perhaps 3,000 years ago, and who stood a full head and shoulders above any normal human being. In one newspaper account he described over 3,000 skeletons, almost all of them male, averaging 7 feet in height. One measured 7 feet 8. Another, he said, was even larger. His most famous find came in 1928, a magnificent soapstone urn, and inside it, he said, the skeleton of a young girl, a princess, perhaps, of high rank, clutching the rim of the vessel. Encircling her, again, the bones of 64 children. And beneath the entire arrangement, the remains of a giant man, apparently killed by the spear still lodged in his side. It is a spectacular image. It is also, according to every serious investigator who has looked at it since, a fiction. Glidden could never produce the giant skeleton for independent examination. The urn was real and survives to this day in a museum collection. The princess and her 64 children and the speared giant beneath them did not. But this is exactly where the story stops being a simple tale of one con man and starts becoming something that a certain kind of researcher cannot let go of. Because Ralph Glidden did not stop at giants. He claimed he had found evidence of white Indians on the island. He claimed he had discovered an ancient map. And that map, he said, led to a lost temple. A temple of the sun god, he called it, a structure he insisted had been greater in scope than Stonehenge itself, sitting somewhere out there under the brush and the soil of a small California island that the world thought it already understood completely. Now stand back from the individual claims for a moment, because the individual claims are where the debunkers win every time, and fairly so. Stand back and look at the shape of the whole thing. A lost race of great stature, a vanished high civilization, monumental architecture erased from the map, an advanced people written out of the record and replaced in the official history by a story of simpler origins. If you have spent any time in the corners of history that the textbooks refuse to visit, that shape is deeply, uncomfortably familiar. Because Catalina is not the only place this happened. That is the detail that keeps the researchers up at night. Across the 19th and early 20th centuries, all over North America, the same story surfaces again and again. A farmer ploughs a field and turns up bones too long to be normal. A crew digging a canal or a railway cut opens an ancient burial mound and reports skeletons of astonishing size. Local newspapers print the accounts, often with names, measurements, and the names of the men who witnessed them, and then, without exception, the remains go missing. They are sent away for study and never seen again. They are lost in transit. They end up, the accounts say, in the possession of a museum or a foundation, and then they simply drop out of the record. The pattern became so consistent that it grew its own legend. The belief that the great institutions of American science quietly gathered up every anomalous skeleton and made it disappear, not out of malice but out of something colder, a need to protect an accepted timeline from evidence that would not fit. Before I go further, that document in the pinned comment. If you have not found it yet, go there now, because everything I cover in these videos is one piece of a pattern that only becomes visible when you see all 35 cases together. The document shows you the full pattern. What I can show you here is the surface. What is down there is everything underneath it. Pinned comment, now. Whether or not you believe there was ever a single hand behind it, the mechanical fact remains unsettling. An enormous number of these reports exist, and almost none of the physical evidence survives to be tested. The stories were allowed to live as folklore precisely because the bones were never allowed to live as data. Catalina is that pattern in its purest form. A vast excavation, sensational claims of great stature, institutional money that arrives and then withdraws, and thousands of skeletons that scatter into collections and warehouses until no one can fully say where they went. This is the pattern that sits at the center of the revisionist model of the past. The idea is not that one grave on one island held one unusually large man. The idea is that the history we are taught is not a neutral record of what happened. It is a curated product, a story assembled and maintained by institutions, and that whenever the physical evidence in the ground contradicts the approved story, it is the evidence that gets removed, not the story that gets rewritten. In that model, the past we have lost is not a gap, it is a deletion. There was, the theory goes, an earlier world, a civilization more advanced, more widespread, and more capable than the timeline allows. And at some point that world was interrupted, buried, reset. The survivors were absorbed into the story of a younger, smaller, less capable humanity, and the monuments they left behind were reassigned to later builders, or explained away, or simply dug up and shipped off to the basements of museums where no member of the public would ever see them again. The believers point to the way the ground itself seems to swallow the recent past. Whole buildings across the world stand with their first floors buried below the current street level, their original doors and windows now half sunk beneath the soil, as if a wave of earth rolled across the planet within historical memory, and no one wrote down why. They point to structures the accepted history struggles to explain, built with a precision and on a scale that seems to belong to a different order of capability than the era they are assigned to. And they point to the strange, recurring silence in the record right at the moment things get interesting, the blank pages, the convenient fires that destroyed the archives, the expeditions whose findings were never published. To the revisionist, history is not a smooth line. It is a repaired surface, and if you learn to see the seams, you start noticing them everywhere. You do not have to accept a word of that to feel the force of the underlying discomfort, because the discomfort is not really about mudfloods or resets. It is about trust. It is the growing suspicion that the story of who we are and where we came from was assembled by people with reasons, and that we have been handed the finished product and told never to look behind it. Once that suspicion takes hold, a story like Catalina stops sounding like a hoax and starts sounding like a leak. Watch how neatly Catalina fits that frame. A man digs into the ground. He pulls out bones that, he claims, belong to a taller, older, vanished people. Institutional money floods in, while the digging is useful and the crates flow east. And then, the instant the story turns from ordinary artifacts into something that challenges the accepted origin of the people on this coast, the funding is severed, the man is cut loose, his reputation is dismantled. The bones are scattered to collectors and warehouses, and within a generation the entire episode is filed under fraud and forgotten. To the revisionist eye, that is not the story of a hoax being corrected. That is the story of a mechanism working exactly as designed. And here is where the economic history comes in, because this was never really about anthropology. Follow the money, and a different picture forms. Who paid for the digging? A private fortune built on oil and finance, funneled through a foundation that controlled one of the largest collections of native artifacts on Earth. In the revisionist reading, collections like that are not just displays. They are the physical archive of legitimacy. Whoever holds the bones and the artifacts holds the authority to say what the past was. And whoever says what the past was gets to say who has a rightful claim to the land, the resources, and the story of the continent going forward. Control the origin story and you control the deed. That is the quiet economic engine underneath every argument about who was here first and what they were capable of. If the accepted story is that the people of this coast were simple and few, then the land was, in the brutal logic of conquest, effectively empty, waiting to be developed, monetized, sold in lots to tourists arriving on a steamer. But if the ground holds evidence of a vast, advanced, organized civilization, a civilization with monumental temples and a reach that dwarfed the official account, then the entire foundation of who owns what, and by what right, begins to tremble. So ask the uncomfortable question. If you were an institution whose authority rested on being the keeper of the approved past, and a carpenter on a resort island started pulling a different past out of the dirt, what exactly would you do? Would you double down on funding a story that undermined the value of every other collection you owned? Or would you quietly declare the research finished, cut the check off, and let the man discredit himself in a house of bones? That is the theory, and I want to be honest with you about the other side of it, because you deserve the whole picture, and not just the seductive half. The mainstream answer to all of this is not a conspiracy. It is simpler and, frankly, sadder. The remains Ralph Glidden dug up were not a lost race of anything. The ancestors of a people who are still here, still fighting to reclaim their history and their dead. Modern forensic anthropology has studied the skeletal record of this coast in detail, and the people of these islands stood at ordinary heights, roughly 5 feet to 5 feet 8, the same as the mainland populations they were related to. There were no 9-foot giants. The measurements were exaggerated or invented. The blonde hair was a fantasy laid over the bones to make them exotic and sellable, and, not incidentally, to feed an ugly early 20th century appetite for stories in which the impressive things in the Americas were built by anyone other than Native Americans. That last part matters, and it is worth saying plainly, because the giant myth was never harmless. Stories of vanished white founders were used, again and again, to strip living indigenous peoples of the credit for their own ancestors' achievements. The lost race is often just a mask for an old and cruel idea that the real builders must have been someone else. So when we sit with the mystery of Catalina, we should never lose sight of the fact that the bones at the center of it were real people, that they were robbed from their graves, and that their descendants have spent decades trying to bring them home. And that fight is the part of the story that is still going on right now, long after Glidden and his showmanship turned to dust. The scattering of his collection created a nightmare that the Tongva and the institutions holding those remains are still working to untangle. Bones and funerary objects that were dug up and sold and traded across the country in the collecting frenzy of the early 20th century have to be located, identified, and matched back to the island they were stolen from before they can ever be returned to the ground. It is slow, painful, bureaucratic work, made harder by exactly the thing the revisionists point to, the fact that so many of these remains pass through so many hands and so many inventories that the paper trail runs cold. When a man treats human beings as commodities, he does not keep the kind of records that let their descendants find them again a century later. The chaos in the archive is real. What people disagree about is whether that chaos was carelessness, greed, or design. There is a grim symmetry in it. The same disorder that makes the giant story impossible to prove or disprove is the same disorder that keeps the real dead from going home. The bones cannot testify for the revisionist, and they cannot rest for the Tongva for exactly the same reason. They were turned into inventory, and inventory does not remember where it came from. Glidden's own end was not the end of a vindicated genius. His museum limped through the following decades and finally closed in 1950. He had planned to crown it with a 16-foot skull mounted so that visitors could see it as their boats sailed into Avalon's harbour. That monument to himself was never built. He spent the last 18 years of his life still telling the same expanding stories to anyone who would listen, and fewer people listened. His enormous collection of remains was eventually broken up. Some of it, in a bitter irony he could never have appreciated, went to the very institutions whose approval he had craved. So, on the evidence, the case is closed. A promoter invented a race of giants to save a failing museum, and science eventually cleaned up the mess he left behind. And yet, notice what a tidy explanation requires you to ignore. It requires you to ignore that a serious, well-funded institution backed this man for years and then severed ties at the precise moment his findings turned inconvenient. It requires you to accept that thousands of skeletons can be excavated, catalogued, shipped, sold, and dispersed so thoroughly that today no one can fully account for where they all went. It requires you to trust that every measurement that pointed towards something anomalous was an error or a lie, and that every measurement that fit the accepted story was sound. It asks you to believe that the only unreliable narrator in this entire affair was the one man without a degree, and that the wealthy foundations and the museums and the newspapers that amplified him and then abandoned him were simply passive bystanders to his fraud. Maybe that is exactly what happened. Maybe Ralph Glidden was nothing more than a gifted liar with a shovel, and the institutions around him were guilty of nothing worse than briefly believing him. That is the most likely version. I will say it clearly so there is no confusion. On the balance of the evidence, the giants were not real. But the revisionist point was never really that the giants were literally real. The point is about the machinery. The point is that we are being asked to reconstruct the deep past of an entire continent from fragments that passed through the hands of grave robbers, showmen, private fortunes, and institutions that had every financial reason to prefer one story over another. The point is that the record we inherited is not the raw truth of the ground. It is what survived a process. And processes have owners, and owners have interests. The ground under Catalina still holds its dead. Most of them will never be studied, never be named, never be returned. The urn sits in a museum case. The town sells tickets to a different kind of tourist now, one who comes for the beaches and the boats and never wonders what is a few feet beneath the golf course and the harbour road. And somewhere in the boxes of a collection built on oil money and cut off in the spring of 1924, the bones that Ralph Glidden pulled out of that hillside are still waiting, still silent, still telling a story that depends entirely on who is allowed to speak for them. Stand on that island today, and the surface tells you nothing. The harbour is bright, the casino ballroom still turns its lights on at night. The boats come and go across the same channel the Tongva crossed in their sewn plank canoes 1,000 years before anyone drew a border on a map. Nothing about it whispers that 4,000 people were pulled out of this ground and sold, or that for a few strange years this quiet resort was the centre of an argument about the true shape of human history. The island keeps its secrets the way the earth always does, patiently, and without any obligation to tell you the truth. So the next time you are told that the history of a place is settled, that the experts have measured it and closed the file, remember a carpenter on a small California island who dug too deep, found something the money did not want found, and was erased so completely that a century later we still cannot agree on what he actually held in his hands. The past is not a fixed thing waiting to be discovered. It is a territory, and like every territory that has ever mattered, it belongs to whoever controls the map. Ralph Glidden drew a different map, and in the spring of 1924 someone decided that map would never be printed, which is not, of course, the same thing as deciding that the map was ever wrong.